Good morning. It is so good to be here with you this morning. I am a big fan, and I admire you all from a distance from Greensboro, all that you do here. As Chrissy mentioned, I share a connection to Campbell University with your pastor, Ben, and also was a student of Bill Leonard's while at Wake, and I understand that he has been here with you for the last 2 weeks. And I trust that he was every bit as fiery and animated and bold and prophetic as he always is. If you can imagine, he was just like that in the classroom 2 days a week, every week for 4 years. And that was really a gift to us and wonderful, and was something that Justin and Chrissy and I shared. So I met Justin and Chrissy while at Wake, and really this is why I am so glad to be with you, because you are home and family to 3 of my very favorite people on the planet. They are, as you know, embodiment of hospitality and friendship and grace and love. I know that you have gotten to know them in that way too, and their Mia is just amazing. And so to be with you, who are their family, is like being with my own family. If you caught the bio that Chrissy so carefully crafted for me in your wonderful newsletter, then you learned about me that I am a mom of 2 small children, our 1-year-old Spitfire little girl, Marin, and our 3-year-old ball of energy, Lucas. Which also means that I find myself wandering the halls of my home more often late at night than I would like. This usually begins with a call from my 3-year-old from his bedroom down the hall. With the help of a light that filters in through our bathroom window, I can see well enough to make my way to the hallway. Carefully placed night lights along the hallway wall ensure that I safely avoid stepping on the building block, the Batman Lego boat, the Lightning McQueen car that was left out during bedtime cleanup. As I approach their room, I pull shut the door on the bathroom light that we left on for them. I check in with Lucas. I reassure him that he is okay. I lie down for a moment until he falls back asleep. And then I begin my journey back to my bed. If my 1-year-old is going to wake up, this is when that happens. Just as I am crawling back under my covers, I hear a quieter voice yell for Mom. She is not as easy to soothe as her brother. She will need a bottle. We make our way to the kitchen and open the refrigerator door. I don't know why refrigerator lights have to be so bright, but we can light our entire kitchen with our refrigerator. We pull the milk from the shelf and assemble her bottle. As we shut the door, it takes my eyes a moment to adjust, but I find the street light just outside my window, and the night makes sense to my eyes again. We head back to bed. You know, I take for granted how available and accessible light is to us, especially at that dark hour of night. Truthfully, it has been my experience with light most of my life, but I am reminded that this is not true for everyone. Each night before we go to bed, my mother-in-law, who lives with us, stands out on our back deck looking at the stars. And each night, when she comes back in, she reports, you know, the sky used to be full of stars. It's just not like that anymore. We know that the sky is still full of stars, but her experience with light pollution has changed significantly since she was a young farm girl in eastern North Carolina. But for most of us, this is true. Every waking moment is saturated with light. But what do we actually know about light? So in 2014, NPR's Planet Money podcast ran an episode on the history of light. They told us that for thousands of years, getting light was a huge hassle. Long before there were light bulbs, there was fat. If you wanted to light up your cave or your mud hut, or if you were really lucky, a castle, you had to find some fat. Something to use for a wick, maybe moss or a piece of fabric, and then you had to find a way to light it on fire. This was not easy, and it did not look like the candles you know. It would look something more like that middle picture on the front of your bulletin. People used whatever they could find to make candles. Native Americans in the United States and the Pacific Northwest often used salmon. They basically made a salmon candle. In the tropics, people would catch fireflies to make a kind of firefly lantern, something all of us here in the South have tried at least once in our life. In northern Scotland, they used a bird, an oily bird called a petrel. That would be their lamp. In ancient Babylon, people used lamps for light, and an entire day's wage, you could get the equivalent of about 10 minutes of light. For about 4,000 years, very little then changes with light. There were small improvements. The Romans figure out how to make a better lamp. People start to find better sources of oil, like whales, which is terrible news for whales. But even up to 1700s, life still looks more like ancient Babylon than it does today. Then, in the 1800s, a few things happen. In 1850, a guy in Canada discovered kerosene, which is not just a slightly better wick or slightly more efficient lamp, but a significantly better energy source that was brighter and cleaner and cheaper. With kerosene lamps, a whole day's labor could get you about 5 hours of light. Not long after, Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, and then by 1882 had established one of the first plants that made it possible to light up about half a lower block of Manhattan. Now, with the advancements in both light bulbs and electricity, one day's wage can get us about 20,000 hours of light. Look where we are now. When shopping, you will find as much variety in light bulbs as you do in toothpaste. You can light a darkened room by simply clapping your hands. You can carry light around in your pocket, or even smaller on your keychain. We can prolong a friendly soccer game by turning on a whole field of lights. The progress of light is about more than just light. It explains why the world is the way it is, and why we aren't just subsistence farmers, why we can afford to be artists and massage therapists and plumbers or pastors telling you about light from the pulpit on a Sunday morning. Our experience with light is very different from those who would have been listening to the passage that we listened to this morning. Our light is accessible and bright as compared to lamplight that was both precious and dim. Our experience with darkness is also very different. In ancient Babylon, the night's dark would have been stark and engulfing. We, on the other hand, can easily escape the dark with night lights and cell phones and street lamps and digital clocks. We might measure the progress of history in the increasing presence of light, but Isaiah was measuring the progression of Israel's history in the prolonged absence of light. Israel was reaching rock bottom of a downward spiral that began in the garden. It withstood the flood. It knew both slavery and freedom from slavery. It carried on through the violent days of the judges into the failed reign of kings. And now Israel is suffering in exile, which the prophets have told us is a result of their own arrogance. Home and temple destroyed, they are displaced in a foreign land. I'm not sure we can really comprehend the depth or the reality of their hopelessness or the stark darkness that they would have felt. The book of Isaiah is 66 chapters. They are in exile for over 200 years by the time that we get to them here in chapter 60. Their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, their great-great-great-grandparents, you get it, have all been in exile. The book of Isaiah is a wavering book between hope and hopelessness, between abandon and promise, between comfort and judgment. In one verse, the people who have walked in darkness have seen a great light. And in the next verse, the Lord will cut them off, Israel, both head and tail. In one chapter, Assyria is the rod of God's anger against Israel, and in the next, Israel is the shoot from which God's promise will come. It is a complicated book. The first 39 chapters tell of Israel's rebellion against God and their fall to Assyria. The last 16 chapters tell us of Israel's captivity to Babylon and Persia, and then their eventual return home. Scholars estimate that between chapters 39 and chapters 40, there was 150 years of silence. I considered having someone from your congregation read these two and have a 150-second pause. But we are so uncomfortable with silence. You would have quickly begun looking through your bulletin to make sure that we were still on track. Your ministers especially would have begun looking. It is something about silence that makes us as uncomfortable as the dark does. But really, for Israel, what was there to say? This 150 years feeling defeated, captive in a foreign land, abandoned, rejected, ashamed, afraid. Israel had entered into a dark time of chaos. It was silent. Darkness, in this sense, is thought of as a universal experience, but no one knows our darkness quite like we do. How we find ourselves treading the watery chaos of our own lives, just barely keeping our heads above the churning chaos of our well-hidden addictions, our failing marriage, our list of disappointments or unfulfilled ambitions, our unrealistic image of who we should have been, our unpredictable bouts with depression, anxiety, bipolar, the lies that keep telling us that we will never be enough, the temptation to think that our life is dispensable, our self-hatred in all of its forms. It is a darkness that overwhelms us and isolates us. We corner ourselves in our darkness, convinced that our struggles are too much for God, or that we are inconsequential to God. And so we find ourselves also, like Israel, staring into a silent void between us. It's important that we be careful how we talk about darkness. In her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark, Barbara Brown Taylor reminds us that if we aren't careful, we will divide every day in two, pitting the light against the dark part, often tucking all the sinister stuff into the dark and identifying God only with the light. From the earliest times, Christians have used darkness as a synonym for sin, for ignorance, for spiritual blindness and death. This is not the way that we are supposed to talk about darkness. It also gives us a way of tucking things into some giant closet that make us feel uncomfortable, that frighten us. But we have to be careful with our language. We talk about dark history and dark past, or the dark corners of our souls in ways that harm us and that harm others. We suggest that there are places within us that are too dark for God, that are inaccessible to God, and in doing so, we cut ourselves off from the very life source, from the one who in the beginning breathed life into our being. We have to remember it all started in darkness. So how can we talk about darkness without talking about the creative darkness from which God called forth the earth? How can we talk about dark without recalling the shapeless void that created space for the stars, the fertile ocean beds that birthed animal life, the churning primal waters brimming with fish? For almost 200 years, Israel was in exile. There was no one left who actually remembered the promised land. The stories of their faith are losing distinction as they begin to mix in translation and the retelling of other native stories. They can no longer muster the energy or the courage to hope for something different when from out of the chaos Isaiah speaks. Arise, for your light has come. Darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the people, but nations will come to your light. I wonder if they heard the echoes of the creation narrative. How could you not? Calling forth the light from within the darkness and blessing it all as good. This Israel who had spired back into their chaotic abyss, from the place from which it was first created, this nation that had long waited to return to its home, these people who felt God forsaken and God forgotten, they were being made new. If God had indeed been silent, God had not been absent. In this text, it becomes clear that God had been with them all along, working within them to bring new life, transformation, and renewal. They would not be the same people they were when they first entered into exile. They would be new people, a light for others to live by, an example of God's love and God's faithfulness in the world. This passage from Isaiah is a reminder that we too are not God-forsaken or God-forgotten. Even when we feel that the chaos of life is swallowing us whole, even when we think there are parts of ourselves that not even God can redeem, when we, like Israel, find ourselves held captive by our addictions or our fears, our failure or shame, when we, like Israel, know the depth of loneliness and exile, if we, like Israel, are overwhelmed by hopelessness, if we, like Israel, have lost our sense of who we are to dementia or our jobs or our families or our choices, Isaiah reminds us that you are not alone. You are known, you are loved, you are seen and worthy and chosen, that you are light. This passage from Isaiah also is a reminder to us that the darkest parts of our history, both our individual history and that of our collective past, are not the end of our story, but should become the fertile ground for transformative light and life. The Gospel of John begins with light. It says, "What has come into being in him was life, and the life was light and hope to the people. The light shined in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." When Matthew and Luke begin their story with Jesus, it is with his birth, a reminder to us that Jesus was like us. But when John writes his beginning, it is a beginning with light, a reminder to us that we are like him, that we are holy light. We are light and are called into light, into patterns of living that promote and offer life and hope and joy and peace and love to the world. It is so evident to me here that you strive faithfully to be this kind of life-giving light in the community around you. To all who come in your doors or sit at your tables or share in life and food and fellowship and dialogue here, there is no doubt to me that your open to all approach to Christian community has given safe space to people who have found hurt and rejection and judgment in other spaces. I have seen how your Awakening series strives honestly to face and to name the systems of injustice that continue to do harm to our communities. And I see the ways that you are transforming your city and that you are being transformed by the relationships that you create. And I really love your forever forward commitments to honor this 75th anniversary here at Myers Park, to continuously explore and deepen your faith, to build a culture of radical relationship, to boldly practice compassion in the world, and to cultivate resources with a consideration for who will come next. I am inspired by the ways that these commitments took into consideration the importance of casting your light into the future generations who will receive it. I'm sure that your 70-year history has also included times of difficulty and struggle, that all the time you are being reshaped and transformed by the difficult justice-seeking work that you do. But also know that there are ways that you are radiating light and receiving light and embodying light that you are not even aware of. The poet Jan Richardson writes, "I cannot tell you how the light comes. What I know is that it is more ancient than imagining, that it travels across an astounding expanse, that it loves searching out what is hidden, what is lost, what is forgotten or in peril or in pain. We can measure the progression of our history with God through the creative darkness that transforms us and through the life-giving light that fills us. We do not know how the light comes, only that it does, that it will, that in the hope of this Isaiah passage, that the light is with us. If the arc of God's grace bends through history toward radical justice, then the arc of God's light bends toward each one of us in extravagant love. The light of God's love finds us amidst the chaos of life. It takes hold within us and transforms our souls. And by the grace of God, through it, it goes from us into the world. Amen.